In 1967, a CIA officer walked into a remote schoolhouse in Bolivia. On the dirt floor, a wounded man. Captured. Barely alive. The officer looked him in the eyes and said, "You should have thought of this sooner." The man smiled back. The next morning he was executed. But here's what most people don't talk about. That man's face went on to become the most reproduced image in the history of photography. More printed than the Mona Lisa. More recognized than most heads of state. A man killed by the system. Became the permanent symbol of everyone who ever wanted to burn that system down. His name was Ernesto Che Guevara. And what I'm about to tell you is not the t-shirt version. Part 1, The Boy Who Couldn't Breathe. To understand what Che became, you first have to understand what Che suffered. He was born on June 14, 1928, in Rosario, Argentina. Into a middle-class family, educated parents, comfortable home. On the surface, it sounds like the start of a perfectly ordinary life. But at age 2, Ernesto Guevara almost died. He developed severe asthma, the kind that doesn't just inconvenience you, the kind that pins you to a bed at 3 in the morning, fighting for every single breath. His entire childhood was built around this disease. His family moved cities trying to find better air for him. His mother taught him at home because he couldn't always make it to school. His father would carry him on his shoulders during asthma attacks just to help him breathe easier. And here's something most people miss about this. That boy who spent years watching the world from a window, unable to run, unable to breathe freely. He grew up obsessed with freedom. Not as an abstract idea. As something physical. Something he had literally been denied. Despite the asthma, Che pushed himself harder than anyone around him. He played rugby. He swam. He cycled long distances. It was almost like he was in a constant argument with his own body. And he read. Constantly. By his teenage year. He had already worked through Marx, Freud, Neruda, Faulkner, Kafka, and Jules Verne. He kept a personal philosophy journal, handwritten notes on everything from existentialism to economic theory. This was not a boy being radicalized by anyone. This was a boy building a worldview entirely on his own. And then came the motorcycle. Part 2, The Motorcycle Diaries. In January 1952, 23-year-old Ernesto Guevara, still a medical student, climbed onto a barely functional 1939 Norton 500cc motorcycle with his friend Alberto Granado. Their plan? Ride from Buenos Aires to the tip of South America and back. No fixed itinerary. No corporate sponsors. Just 2 young men, a broken-down bike, and a continent. For the first few weeks, it was exactly the adventure it sounds like. They camped under stars. They charmed their way into free meals. They played football with locals and drank bad wine. But here is where things took a dark turn. The further they traveled, the more Che saw. He saw the copper mines of Chuquicamata in Chile, where indigenous workers labored in brutal conditions for wages that barely kept them alive, while American corporations shipped the profits out of the country. He met a communist couple, hunted by the government, sleeping in the open desert because they had nowhere else to go. Cold, hungry, stateless. Their only crime was believing something the powerful didn't like. He visited a leper colony in the Amazon, where the sick had been literally removed from society, cast aside because they were inconvenient. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. A 23-year-old medical student, trained to heal people, watching human beings discarded like broken machinery. In his journal, later published as the Motorcycle Diaries, Che wrote that he was no longer the same person who had left Buenos Aires. He said that all of Latin America's pain, the mines, the poverty, the cold couple in the desert, had stopped being something outside him. It had become him. Most revolutionaries are made by ideology. Che Guevara was made by a road trip. That's what makes his story different from almost every other revolutionary in the 20th century. He didn't sit in a library and theorize about suffering. He drove straight into it. And when he finally came back, he wasn't a student anymore. He was something else entirely. Part 3, Guatemala and the American Hand. After finishing medical school in 1953, Che didn't go home and set up a clinic. He packed a bag and headed to Guatemala. Now, why Guatemala? Because in 1953, Guatemala was the most interesting political experiment in the Western Hemisphere. A democratically elected president named Jacobo Arbenz was doing something radical, something that powerful people absolutely hated. He was giving land back to poor farmers. Guatemala at the time was essentially controlled by the United Fruit Company, a massive American corporation that owned enormous tracts of land, controlled the country's main railroad, and had deep connections inside the U.S. government. Their land sat unused, while Guatemalan peasants had nothing. Arbenz said, "Enough." He began redistributing unused land to the poor. He offered compensation to the company based on the value they had declared for tax purposes. The United Fruit Company was furious. because the value they had declared for tax purposes was deliberately low. They had been cheating on taxes for years, and now they were being paid exactly what they said the land was worth. They went straight to Washington, and Washington listened. The CIA, under the direct authorization of President Eisenhower, organized a covert operation called Operation PBS Success. They trained a small group of Guatemalan exiles, flooded the country with propaganda, and in June 1954, Arbenz' government collapsed. Che was there. He watched all of it happen in real time. He tried to organize armed resistance. He reached out to political groups. He went to the Mexican embassy seeking help. Nobody came. Arbenz resigned. The democratically elected government of a sovereign nation was dismantled, not by its own people, but by a foreign corporation and a foreign intelligence agency. Here's what I want you to understand about this moment. Before Guatemala, Che Guevara was a leftist idealist, someone who believed that maybe the system could be changed from within, that democracy, if given the chance, could deliver justice. After Guatemala, that belief was completely gone. He concluded, with a cold and permanent certainty, that the United States would never allow genuine economic reform in Latin America, that any leader who tried to redistribute wealth, nationalize resources, or prioritize the poor over foreign corporations would be destroyed. Not defeated at the ballot box, destroyed. And if that was true, then the ballot box was not enough. This was the moment Che Guevara decided that revolution was not optional. It was the only logical response. Part 4. Mexico City and the Man in the Room. After Guatemala fell, Che fled to Mexico City. He was broke, stateless, increasingly radicalized and working as a street photographer to survive. And then, in the summer of 1955, a mutual friend introduced him to a Cuban lawyer and revolutionary named Fidel Castro. They talked for 10 hours straight on their first meeting. 10 hours. By the end of that conversation, Che had agreed to join Castro's movement to overthrow the Batista dictatorship in Cuba. Now I want to give you a little context on Cuba at this time, because it matters. Fulgencio Batista was a dictator who had seized power in a military coup in 1952. He ran Cuba essentially as a private business operation for American corporations, American organized crime, and a thin layer of Cuban elites. Havana's casinos and hotels were playgrounds for the American wealthy. Meanwhile, Cuban sugar workers, farmers, and the rural poor lived in conditions that were frankly medieval. Batista's secret police were notorious. Political opponents disappeared. Torture was standard. Castro wanted him gone. Che, after Guatemala, wanted every version of this arrangement gone. Not just in Cuba, everywhere. They were, in that sense, different kinds of revolutionaries. Castro was fundamentally a Cuban nationalist. His primary goal was Cuba. Che was something broader and more dangerous. He genuinely believed that the entire global economic order was a system of organized theft, and that it needed to be dismantled, country by country, if necessary. But for now, they had the same enemy. And in December 1956, 82 men boarded a leaking yacht called the Granma, crossed the Gulf of Mexico, and landed on the coast of Cuba. Almost immediately, Batista's forces ambushed them. Of the 82 men who landed, only about 20 survived the first week. Che was one of them. Part 5. The Sierra Maestra, where the legend was born. The survivors retreated into the Sierra Maestra mountains in eastern Cuba, cold, hunted, outnumbered, and from those mountains over the next 2 years, they built a revolution. Che quickly became indispensable, not just as a fighter, but as a doctor, a strategist, and a teacher. He ran literacy programs for the peasant communities that sheltered them. He treated the sick. He also commanded military operations with a ruthlessness that surprised even his own comrades. And this is the complicated part of Che's story that many people skip over. Because the man who opened field clinics for poor farmers was the same man who ordered executions of informers and deserters without hesitation. He was not a gentle revolutionary. He never claimed to be. In his own writings, he described the revolutionary as someone who must be capable of great love and great violence, and who must feel no contradiction between the two. Whether you find that terrifying or logical probably depends on where you stand on history. By 1958, the revolution was gaining momentum. Batista's military was demoralized and corrupt. Popular support for Castro's forces was growing across the country. And then Che pulled off the military operation that ended the war. In late December 1958, he led a column of rebel fighters on a surprise attack on the city of Santa Clara. They derailed an armored train full of Batista's troops and weapons. They captured the city in 2 days. When Santa Clara fell, Batista knew it was over. On New Year's Eve 1958, Batista boarded a plane and fled Cuba forever. On January 8, 1959, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara entered Havana in triumph. The revolution had won. Part 6. Power and its price. And now comes the part of the story that the t-shirt doesn't tell you. Because after the revolution, Che was given real power, and what he did with it tells you everything about who he really was. He was appointed head of La Cabaña prison, and in the months following the revolution, hundreds of Batista officials, informers, and counter-revolutionaries were tried and executed there. Che oversaw this process personally. Historians still debate the exact numbers. Estimates range from a few hundred to over 1,000 executions in that period. Che did not deny this. He defended it publicly. He called it a necessary part of consolidating a revolution against people who would otherwise destroy it. There is no comfortable way to process this if you believe in Che as a pure hero. But there's also no honest way to process the previous government's atrocities and ignore the context. History is rarely a clean story, and Che's story is no exception. Beyond La Cabaña, Che also became the president of Cuba's National Bank, and later the Minister of Industry. He was now running economic policy for an entire country, and he was a disaster at it. His rigid application of Soviet-style central planning, refusing to allow market mechanisms, prioritize his rigid application of Soviet-style central planning, refusing to allow market mechanisms, prioritizing ideological purity over practical outcomes, contributed to serious economic problems in Cuba through the early 1960s. He knew it too. He was honest enough, in private, to acknowledge that the economic model wasn't working the way he had envisioned. But rather than adapt, he doubled down on the belief that the problem was insufficient commitment to the revolutionary ideal. And then, in 1965, he did something that shocked everyone. He disappeared. Part 7. The Final Mission and the Schoolhouse in Bolivia. Che Guevara resigned all of his Cuban government positions, renounced his Cuban citizenship, and vanished from public life. He resurfaced briefly in the Congo, trying to ignite a Marxist revolution there. It failed badly. The local fighters were poorly organized, the conditions were brutal, and Che himself fell ill. He came back to Cuba quietly, regrouped, and then made his final decision. Bolivia. He believed Bolivia was the ideal place to launch a continental South American revolution. Landlocked, surrounded by countries with poor rural populations, he thought a guerrilla movement there could spread outward like a fire. He was wrong. The Bolivian peasants did not support him the way the Cuban peasants had. They were suspicious of outsiders. The Bolivian Communist Party refused to cooperate. The CIA, which had been tracking him, worked closely with the Bolivian military to find him. By October 1967, Che's small band of guerrillas had been weakened by months of failed operations, disease, and defections. On October 8, Bolivian rangers surrounded them in a ravine called Quebrada del Uro. Che was shot in the leg, captured, taken to the nearby village of La Higuera. He was held overnight in a small schoolhouse. The next morning, October 9, 1967, orders came from the Bolivian government, in coordination with Washington, to execute him. A Bolivian sergeant named Mario Terran was given the assignment. He hesitated outside the door. By some accounts, he had to be told twice. Che, knowing what was coming, reportedly told him, "Shoot, you are only going to kill a man." He was 39 years old. Here's what I keep coming back to. Ernesto Guevara started as a boy who couldn't breathe. He became a doctor, then a wanderer, then a witness, then a fighter, then a symbol. He was, depending on how you look at him, a liberator or a killer, a visionary or a fanatic, a hero or a warning, maybe all of those things at once. But here is the question that I think actually matters, more than whether you admire him or despise him. Why does a face on a wall still make governments nervous 60 years after the execution? What does it say about the world, that the image of a man killed for asking whether the poor deserved better is still considered dangerous? That question doesn't have a clean answer, and I think that's exactly why we should keep asking it. If you believe that understanding the economic and political forces that shaped our world is more important than ever, then this channel exists for you. Finance Historian is not about cheerleading any side. It's about giving you the full picture that most people never get. The money behind the ideology, the corporate interests behind the wars, the economic logic behind the history. If that's the kind of content you want to think about, then subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from.